this is Greg Boyce from Auburndale Technology, and today I'd like to talk to you about a new vision for the future I have, or a potential vision for the future. In my essay, American Dream Redefined, I talked about how in the 1970s there was this shift in the idea of what the American dream is. From this idea that, by working together, that by this collaborative approach, we can each do well through our own labor, right? And there was this shift instead to the idea that if you try hard, you can get ahead, like far ahead of everyone else. It's this idea of wealth building as opposed to collaboration. It's a vision of me rather than us. And today, after several decades, we can look around and see what the result of that revised American dream has been. So back in the 70s, or leading up to the 70s at least, there was this idea that the improvements in efficiency in machinery would lead us to the point where people won't need to work as much. So rather than working 40-hour weeks, maybe we'd work 20 hours, or maybe less. I mean, it would really depend on how much need there is for the services you provide, how much need there is for the products you provide. And instead, we've moved to this idea of maximizing shareholder value and maximizing profitability. The result of that has been this massive increase in consumerism. So we overproduce, we overconsume, we use advertising to convince people to buy things that they don't necessarily need. And we've reduced the quality of our products such that they're cheaper to buy, but they don't necessarily last as long. So you're always going to need to buy more. So it's building and perpetuating this consumer base. Now, the result of that has been layoffs. The result of that has been jobs being shipped overseas to where the labor is cheaper. It has been people's jobs being replaced through automation with not necessarily any backup careers available for them. Even when you destroy manufacturing jobs, for example, and you replace them with automation, you're going to create new jobs for maintaining the automation, but there's going to be less of them, and they're going to require a much more advanced skill set. So let's say you have a net, even if you had a net positive on jobs, the jobs aren't going to go to the same people who previously had the other jobs. Those people are just sort of left by the wayside. And that, in my mind, is very much contrary to the original American dream, that together, through collaboration, we can all do well together as a people, right? As we move more towards the global economy, we were able to, do all sorts of tricks in order to reduce cost and increase customer bases. And basically, rather than a collaborative system, we very much created a competitive system. Well, that has driven a massive increase in technology, an increase in knowledge. It has built a lot of things, and it has destroyed the environment. At the end of the day, the people who are responsible for overconsumption in our planet, which is essentially what's killing us, are the people who consume the most. Some random worker, maybe they use too much energy at home, they use too much gas to get to work or whatever. That's a drop in the bucket compared to the amount of expense that goes into maintaining a billionaire's lifestyle, or someone who has millions of dollars. These are people who are going to be flying around a lot more. These are people who, their businesses, in order to increase their profitability, are going to consume more and more resources. They're going to burn more fuel. They're going to use energy in other ways as well. They're going to consume our natural resources. And the benefit of it goes to a small number of people. So you can attribute the consumption of the business to the individual. And it's very clear who is causing the problems, right? It's the people who consume the most, the people who have the most, the people who use the most, the people who have other people consuming on their behalf. So let's when I have this conversation with people, sometimes they will tell me, yes, but if we hadn't done that, then we wouldn't have the state of technology that we do today. We wouldn't have the knowledge we have today. And that is very true. However, that doesn't mean we need to continue down that path. At any point we can change, and it's not like we're time traveling. It's not like we're going back to make a different decision. This technology isn't going to go away. This knowledge is not going to go away. The difference is going to be who it benefits, right? Let's say, actually, I think a great example is Facebook. So Facebook built this great social platform, and they built it primarily on open source software. So open source software uses very much the collaborative approach that I'm proposing here, where everyone works together. So like, for example, you've got computers have an operating system that runs the computer. It used to be that the operating system was developed by a company, for example, like Microsoft with their Windows operating system, that they are very much looking to maximize their profitability, and they're going to be charging for this thing, and it's going to cost a good amount of money, and the only people who can make changes to the code are Microsoft. So they have control, they have financial benefit, and people didn't necessarily have alternatives. So enter open source software. The Linux kernel was initially developed in 1991 by a college student who then made it available to others to contribute to. And a lot of people all worked together. They had different problems they were trying to solve, so they solved it in different ways, and the code base grew over time, such that the majority of the internet is driven by Linux systems these days. If you have a Roku, you've got Linux at home. You probably have Linux running on your television. There might be Linux running on your phone. All Android phones use Linux. It's everywhere, and it's all through this collaborative approach where, by doing this work to benefit ourselves, we help others as well, and we benefit from the work that they do to help themselves. So Facebook builds on top of Linux and a whole bunch of other technologies. So Apache and probably PHP, and there's a whole bunch of programming languages and tools and all sorts of things that that they benefit from, and then they build this platform on top of it, and this platform then connects people and does things like run their targeted advertising, which in the 2016 election was essentially used as a targeting system for disinformation campaigns. That is it. The top part that they own, that they benefit from, that is incredibly destructive, right? So let's say that somebody just said, well, let's wipe out that top part and let's replace that with more open source software, and rather than centralizing so that Facebook controls all of this and they can figure out how to monetize it and they have access to the data, let's figure out how to distribute it instead. So people have the ability to control their own data, and people have the ability to make changes if they want to, right? Well, somebody did this. I contributed to the Kickstarter for a program called Diaspora, probably 15 years ago, maybe a little less, but it's been quite some time. Probably 10 years. So Diaspora still exists today, and there's other tools that do the same sort of functions that Facebook would. So Diaspora is one of them. Friendica is another one of them. These provide the social platform, and it exists in a distributed way where you can host your own instance or you can join someone else's instance. They all connect to each other, and you have this big information sharing, right? So we just cut the head off. Facebook just no longer exists, right? Because Facebook isn't necessary in this regard, and in fact, Facebook's existence is detrimental to society. It's detrimental to our democracy at this point. So let's say you just wiped it off, Facebook goes away, people can still do social networking through these tools. Well, the result of that would be the loss of shareholder value. Billions of dollars of value just goes away. And the billions of dollars in value isn't in the social platform, it is in this targeted advertising. This destructive targeted advertising, no less. Well, personally, I'm not sure I see a reason why advertising still needs to exist at all. I mean, we have this globally connected network. Information spreads. If you build something that is beneficial, people will find out about it, right? Because somebody finds it and they share it with others. There's this whole evangelism thing that can happen that doesn't require any sort of paid advertising. Now, open source, or at least the ideas behind open source, apply in all sorts of other areas as well. So in addition to sharing software, you can do things like sharing designs. So there are computer chips that are designed in an open way, where the design for the chip itself is freely available. If you were to build a location, like build a factory where you could manufacture chips, you could build one of these chips, and the only cost associated with it would be the cost of actually manufacturing the chips. There's no licensing fees or anything like that. And these chips can be used to power computer systems that could then, be used for designing automation for whatever it is that you personally need automation for. All it requires is gaining knowledge, which in today's day is more available to everyone than it's ever been before. Between YouTube and online documentation, there's all sorts of ways that you can go and build up a skill, right? So about 5 years ago, I think it was, I picked up a new hobby of restoring straight razors. This was just something that, I'd heard other people doing. It seemed interesting. You can buy old straight razors that are rusted, that aren't too expensive. And there's effort you can put into restoring them and making them look nice and honing them. And you can actually take this thing that, maybe costs you $10 at an antique store and turn it into something you can sell for $100 if you just put in the labor. And the only thing that it requires is a small amount of raw materials. But for the most part, it is, just your time in learning how to do this and building the skill. Go back hundreds of years, and the way that manufacturing or the way industry in general worked was, whoever was a member of the industry, they had to teach. Like, if you wanted to become a blacksmith, you needed to talk to a blacksmith and learn the blacksmith trade from them. Now, there's online communities, there's online repositories of information, of videos, there's all sorts of ways that if you're willing to dedicate the time to learn, you could potentially build an entire business around something that you learned how to do, right? In my mind, that whole concept of freeing knowledge is antithetical to what we are doing as a society. Very much our businesses focus on intellectual property, right? Copyright law, trademark law, patent law, all of these things. It's all about owning ideas. And we have separately this entire community that is about sharing ideas. And this community builds upon this community. This community works for this community. You take the sharing community and you find other ways to fund it. And you work collaboratively. And this entire thing starts to lose value. And what that would look like is essentially, a deflating of the market, which is exactly what the government is trying to avoid. As much as we decrease the costs required in order to produce things, in order to continue to make as much money as people have been making, you would need to either increase the amount of production that is done, which is rather destructive in a contained system like our world is. We can see the result of that every day. The other option would be to just continue squeezing people out in order to maintain the level of profitability. Now, as you're squeezing people out, those people are also your consumers. So, that is another destructive force. Like, I no longer see a way that this system built entirely upon self-interest can continue to operate. It is heading towards a cliff of one type or another. Either the market is going to crash as a result of overproduction and squeezing of its own marketplace. Either we're going to hit, an ecological cliff, an economic cliff. There's all sorts of ways that this thing will suddenly take a nosedive. The other option is to take what we have and instead, use it to drive self-sufficiency. So think of like the do-it-yourself movement, the whole DIY movement. If you think of the open source community and all these different places that are all collaboratively built. If they're focused on helping other people build their own lives, living on their own, at reducing their costs necessary to survive, that is very much a sustainable model compared to the old model of self-interest and working for people who are focused entirely on self-interest. So I see this idea of how a society could function in the collaborative model. I think I could walk through a simple scenario, a somewhat simple scenario that could help describe it. So, for example, here in the greater Boston area, if you want to buy a house, you may spend several $100,000s for it. If you go a bit further west, within the state itself, so you can definitely look at other parts of the country where it's cheaper, but even within Massachusetts, head out by Worcester, head out by Springfield, costs are much lower. Now, if you and a bunch of friends got together and bought a plot of land and built small houses on it, such that through your collective wealth, you are able to outright own this small community, you could then work together such that your ongoing costs are much lower. So you don't have to pay for rent. You're not going to be paying high taxes on the properties, most likely. You can share all of your living expenses, and you can use each other's expertise and labor in order to minimize the amount of work that you are each required to do in order to just get by. So if there's someone who really enjoys cooking, put them in charge of cooking. Other people, if they want to grow food, you can help them grow food for your local community. And then people tend to have skills, something that they want to provide, or that they're interested in providing. Maybe it's a hobby right now, or maybe it's a skill that they're getting paid for by a company, but it is a skill that could still be useful. So, for example, if you have someone that likes building automation, I'm sure automation would be helpful for various tasks that you could be doing. Or in terms of, rather than replacing appliances, you can actually, put the effort in to fix them as opposed to, just wholesale treating it as a disposable piece. Maybe someone else in your community enjoys writing software. Maybe somebody enjoys. I know my bias is showing there, my own history. But maybe someone weaves, or they enjoy taking care of animals. They're a vet. These are services that you could provide to people outside of your community in order to bring in money to pay for what expenses you have. But at the end of the day, the focus can be upon enjoying your life and doing what you like, as opposed to just doing whatever you need to in order to make it in a place where the living expenses are incredibly high due to people making a lot more money than you are, right? You can either try to outcompete people in the expensive areas, or you can go to an inexpensive area and just focus on what you love. And that seems like a much more rewarding life, and that is something that, our society frowns upon. And it doesn't have to be that way. We have been convinced that in order to lead a happy life, you need to make a lot of money selling your time wholesale to people who only care about themselves. There's a better way to live than that. And there's ways technology can enable it, but only if the people who are building the technology are focused on building a lot better life for others. There's already, like I said, there's already existing communities for this, but we need to think strategically about how to actually make this happen. So, a related piece that I'm not sure how many people are aware of, but these days 3D printing is a big thing. So for about $1,000, I saw an appliance for sale that can 3D print with plastic, with metal, or it can do laser etching, right? So you can potentially print the parts you need depending on what you're trying to do. If you need a piece of hardware, you might be able to just create it where you are. And the cost is going to be much lower, especially because you're basically not depending on the labor of others in order to make these pieces. You can use your own labor. The raw material certainly has costs associated with it. Don't know what the specifics around the cost are, but as long as it makes sense financially for you to print the parts that you want, that is something that you have the ability to do as long as you can make an investment in this hardware to begin with. And then there's this whole online community. There's a site called Thingiverse where people make designs for things to be printed. So you can go and download an existing design for free and then use that design to print the part you need. And that's very much in line with this whole, decrease your cost of living in order to have a happier life. And there's a lot more ways we could do things in a collaborative fashion, right? But it runs contrary to what we've been told our whole lives that we should be doing in order to get ahead. Or at least it goes against what we're taught up here, right? Where, maybe things are a bit different outside of the big cities where it's very much corporate owned. I've never really I grew up in this area, so I've never really lived anything else. But I know, the way of life of my cousins in Minnesota are very different than the way things are here. And I think a lot of that has to do with, living in a place where just the costs are so high. But I see a way we can deal with that strategically. And the result would be a loss in value for the wealthy. And the transition is something that I have no idea how it would go. Because it's not like they're going to give up the land they've bought. It's not like they're going to give up, money is not wealth. Money can buy wealth. Which is another piece of the puzzle here. People focus on money, but if your wealth is stagnant over time and other people are growing, then you're competing against them for whatever resources you need. And that's when you find yourself slipping behind. Well, just something to think about. The way the world works today is based on the history of how we got here. And it doesn't need to remain this way. People haven't changed biologically speaking all that much in the past several thousand years, and life has worked all sorts of different ways. It's all based upon how we think and what we value. And through changing how we think and what we value, we can change the world. We just need to do it. So let's do it. Have a good night.